Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here and to receive Professor Michael Davis, this time at the Faculty of Philosophy. I want to present Professor Michael Davis. He is a research fellow at the UTS Centre for Media Transition, where he leads the Information Integrity Research Program. His current research focuses on the impact of generative AI on news and the digital information ecosystem, regulatory responses to misinformation, and the epistemology of the online public sphere. Prior to UTS, he was Senior Policy Advisor at the Australian Communication and Media Authority, where he worked on misinformation, the news, media, bargaining code, and impartiality in news. Michael has a PhD in philosophy at the Australian National University in Canberra, and he taught philosophy and the history of ideas at the Australian National University and at Universidad de los Andes in Bogotá, Colombia, and media law and ethics at the University of Sydney and UTS. He is a member at the Tech and IP Law Research Cluster and the UTS AI and Data Ethics Cluster, and currently teaches disruptive technologies and the law. Well, the subjects Professor Michael Davis' presentation today is Information, Integrity, AI, and Epistemic Commons. We are very happy to have you here today. The word is yours, please. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Marco, for the kind introduction, and everybody for having me here today. It's a great pleasure. To talk to you about some of my research. Sorry for changing the title a little bit, but so I thought, skip along. So I'm going to talk about a couple of different things today, and a couple of empirical research projects we're doing, and then the kind of conceptual framework that underpins our interpretation of those empirical studies, or my interpretation, I should say. And this kind of informs my approach to regulation of misinformation and AI as well. And it comes down to a kind of its philosophical basis is a Peircean theory of inquiry. So I can talk, I'm going to sort of talk through it, and we'll brush, here and there on Peirce. And if you want to hear more about that Peircean aspect of it, I can go into that a bit more at the end. So when I talk to the lawyers or the communication theorists, I don't touch on the philosophy, but don't go into great depth on it. But I'm certainly happy to do that here. The other kind of aspect, the conceptual frame that I'm using here is a political economy, looking at the influence of tech companies, AI companies, and how they're undermining what I call here the open knowledge ecosystem, or more conceptualize the epistemic commons. I'll touch on policy and legal solutions, but again, not go into too much depth of those. All right. So the beginning of this project here is talking about the open knowledge ecosystem, and this is things like freely available news online, digitized research repositories of academic articles, that is open access, not closed access, and Wikipedia, the world's most popular encyclopedia. And what I'm looking at here is and this is where it starts to get into the Peircean theory of inquiry, but the important thing is the public participation in this open knowledge ecosystem, right? And this is what people participating in the ecosystem produces public value, produces public knowledge, and people have a stake in that ecosystem and the continuation of that ecosystem. And we assert that when I say we, a lot of this comes from some research I've done with a colleague, Heather Ford, on Wikipedia, and I'll go into that a little bit. All right, so we assert that generative AI platforms undermine the integrity of this ecosystem, the open knowledge ecosystem, firstly by exploiting open knowledge for private gain, polluting the ecosystem with low quality information, AI slop and deepfakes and whatnot, impeding communal epistemic practices, so threatening that kind of public participatory model that underpins the open knowledge ecosystem, and even weakening open knowledge infrastructure. And that's, online websites and the way that data is moved from open knowledge repositories like Wikipedia into AI systems, right, and ingested by those systems and then regurgitated as in response to user queries, for example. So how all that sets up is what we're calling the infrastructure in that sense. Right, so the empirical side comes from two projects. One, as I mentioned, on Wikipedia. So this was a project funded by the Wikimedia Foundation, which we applied for a grant with them shortly after the release of ChatGPT in 2022. And that was based on an analysis of online discussions on MetaWiki and other kind of wiki forums and policy boards where people who are closely involved with Wikipedia, who are all volunteers, where they discuss issues on Wikipedia and how it works and so on. So we analysed over 160,000 words of discussion on AI specifically, and then we also conducted some in-depth interviews with volunteers, Wikimedians. They're called at Wikimania 2023, which is a conference that Wikipedians from all around the world go to. We found that the discussion pages were dominated by a small group, mostly English-speaking American, but also German people, and Wikimania gave us a much kind of broader cross-section of people that we could talk to. And the other one is on looking at the impact of generative AI on the news ecosystem in Australia. And that was based on interviews with journalists, editors, product developers there. And we found that there's and that's a Centre for Media Transition project. So Centre for Media Transition, we're half media, half law. And so this was on the media side. We found some commonalities, I guess, in how people were thinking about AI and its impact on the information ecosystem. And that's what I'll go into here. So here's just some examples. Here's an example from Meta's chief AI scientist, kind of really, actually, perhaps probably unintentionally, but putting his finger on the problem that we're seeing here. So that the idea that all freely available, all content, all cultural production, all news, all information should be freely given to AI companies to train their AI models. And then, that sounds reasonable when you're thinking about research, okay, developing AI models for research. But when you're talking about the commercial exploitation of that information that other people have produced and made available for free, that's when you get into the ethical problems, and we'll see epistemic problems as well. Now, Wikipedia, or the Wikimedia Foundation, I should say. What is publicly visible is Wikipedia generally, right? So people go to Wikipedia, they look at articles. But there's much more to Wikipedia than that. There's a whole infrastructure behind it that supports it, and part of that is Wikidata, for example, which structures the data that comes from Wikipedia articles, from images, videos, that kind of thing, and produces structured data to use in AI systems and other systems that draw on structured data for their input. There's Wikipedias in, as you would no doubt know, in hundreds of world languages, and so on. So it goes well beyond what we might imagine Wikipedia to be. So knowledge as a service was a kind of policy that the Wikimedia Foundation developed in 2019 to kind of make things more easily accessible in terms of data. And it saw itself as a kind of service, or a public service, right, providing knowledge for public use. But part of this involved setting up infrastructural ties with AI companies, with Google, for example, for the knowledge graphs that you see at the side of Google search, which often draw on Wikipedia information, and that kind of thing. So the Wikimedia Foundation could see that, okay, Wikipedia was becoming more and more important as a kind of infrastructural element for public knowledge, right? So as it became more and more drawn on in Google, especially, and now in AI and so forth. So this one thing is okay, for the kind of sustainability of Wikipedia, or the longevity of Wikipedia, they saw it as advantageous to cooperate with tech companies to do this, but also in order to kind of avoid the straight ripping off of that content on Wikipedia and manipulation of that content, right? So as you can see here, that there's a need to preserve the reliability of the knowledge and the integrity of the knowledge, right? And it was quite a long process, I think, with Google to do that. So when Google knowledge graphs and so on first appeared on Google searches, Wikipedia wasn't acknowledged as the source of the information, right? It took some years for Wikipedia to become acknowledged as the source of that information. And then you started to see more links coming through and so on. Similarly with Google overviews, right, which is now part of Google search at the beginning, and with ChatGPT and other generative AI systems, they didn't provide links of sources or references at all to begin with, but gradually you're seeing that become incorporated into the output of those systems, including on Google search. Still, even despite that, there's no guarantee, obviously, that the output is accurate. And what I'll talk about here is really how that kind of undermines, so it's not just a problem of accuracy, so integrity is accuracy, but a problem of integrity as the whole ecosystem and how that's undermined by AI. All right, so here's a quote from one of our interviewees saying, look, so in a box on a Google search, so here they're talking about the knowledge panel on the side of a Google search. She was quite happy with that, with Wikipedia information turning up there. But this is different with an LLM like ChatGPT or now Google overviews, because not only do they take information from Wikipedia and synthesize it and regurgitate it in a different form. There's also the potential for AI systems to undermine the ecosystem of Wikipedia completely, because people are staying more and more in the search environment or in the AI chatbot environment, right? So if you can get all the information that you need to get from within Google AI overviews or from within ChatGPT, then you don't need to go to Wikipedia to get that information. And what does that mean? Well, it means that there's less traffic to Wikipedia, and we are actually seeing strong drops in traffic to Wikipedia. If there's less traffic to Wikipedia, there's less awareness of Wikipedia, there's less public donations to Wikipedia, and actually the commercial, it's a non-profit, but it needs revenue to survive. That is undermined, and that's the kind of, and so there you can see, look, there's a sense as well that the open knowledge ecosystem is being taken advantage of by commercial companies, right? So they're taking something that was, it's not, the knowledge is there, it's free to take, but it's not free to produce in the sense that it takes a lot of people's time to compile this information on Wikipedia. And the original sources they draw on are obviously not free to produce either. It's academic research or news articles, whatever it might be. So a lot has gone into this information that is then just, sucked up by AI scrapers. Just skip that one. And so in our news projects, we see exactly the same sentiment where here there's a commercial incentive in that, there's public service media, but there's also commercial news media, right? But commercial news media generally also makes its news available for free, right? Sometimes it's behind a paywall, sometimes it isn't. Even if it's behind a paywall, you can often access it in one way or another, right? So there's a sense here again that AI systems are taking that information, exploiting it for their own purposes. And you can see here, in the process, polluted the information environment, undermined what news journalism has been doing for decades or for centuries. So many news companies have started doing deals with OpenAI and other AI companies. But, you're kind of doing a deal with the devil here. It gives you a bit of income for some time, but it's very difficult to quantify what news is worth, like to a news company, what it's worth to an AI company, and what it's worth to the public good, right? Which really is the fundamental issue that I'm looking at here. All right, so that's by way of introduction to the problem. The first part of the kind of conceptual framework that I'll talk about is from political economy, which is the idea of the commons. Right, so you might have heard of the tragedy of the commons, for example, a concept from the 1960s, political economy, where the commons is a public resource, right, that's made available for the public to use, for any individuals to use. So an example might be a public park, or a national park is another example, right, where the land is publicly owned, right, operated by the government on behalf of the public, and people can go there and freely access it and use it, right? But traditionally, it's a kind of medieval concept where there's, again, founded in land, but there might be a set of common land around a village, and everyone in the village can go and use that land to graze their sheep or cattle or to plant crops, whatever it might be. But they didn't own it individually, right? So it wasn't private land in that sense. The land was publicly held or held in common by, all the people in the community. Obviously, this concept has transformed, over the centuries, but that's the idea of it. Now, the tragedy of the commons occurs where private users can exploit the public resource for their own gain, right? And often, if you can imagine, say somebody moves into the field, fences it off, raises only their own cattle or sheep, and they eat all the grass, and then that person leaves, right? And then the next person comes in, there's no grass left, there's no resource left, right? So you have a kind of resource which is exhaustible, if you like, when it gets used. And so this tragedy of the commons occurs when the benefits are private, okay, and in economic terms they call that rivalrous. So if someone uses it or overuses it, then there's nothing there for the next person to use. Okay, there's a rivalry over the use of the resource. And so the benefits are private, but the costs are shared, okay, meaning that you can't actually exclude anyone from using it, right? And the cost of renewing the resource is borne by the community as a whole, whereas the gain is held by an individual or a company or whatever it might be. All right, so there's a traditional economic theory that you have certain kinds of goods, public goods and common goods and club goods. And and private goods, split into four like that. And the traditional economic theory is a good is one or the other, right? And you can't change it. But in actual fact, the theory is coming to recognise now that things can become club goods that were private goods or common goods. An example is, again, the news. So when the news is put behind a paywall, it becomes a club good in that you have to subscribe to the newspaper in order to read the news. Okay. Whereas if there was no paywall, you can read the news. Anyone can read the news. Okay. Now, the news is non-rivalrous in the sense that if I read the news, that doesn't stop you from reading the news. Okay, the news is still there for anyone to read. So it's different from land in that sense. But when we go to the epistemic commons, we can see that there's a problem that arises. So there's been a bit of work done on what's commonly called the knowledge commons over the last couple of decades. But I'll talk a bit more about in a minute why I call it the epistemic commons instead. But so the knowledge commons is the institutionalized community governance of intellectual and cultural resources. Okay, where the public good of knowledge is recognized and that knowledge is governed in the public interest, okay, and provided to the public as a public good. Right, so knowledge differs from a consumable good. As I said, consuming it doesn't deplete it. Okay, if I read a book, anyone else can read the same book. If there's only one book and I hang on to it, that's a different thing, right? So the knowledge has to be made available to the public to be a public good in this sense. The other problem is that knowledge can be corrupted by misusing it. Okay, so let's say I take some information from a book and then I rip up all the pages, put them together in a different order and give it to you. Okay, the knowledge is then corrupted, right? Now, if you think about what AI systems do, right, they synthesize information from a whole range of different books and rip up the pages and put them together and give it to you. So in that sense, you can see what I'm getting at here in the kind of corruption of knowledge as a public good. The other point is that knowledge can be made excludable, so privatised as a club good by controlling access. Okay, and that example of the news subscription is one example of that. Another example, less exclusive perhaps, but similar, is that I can have access to the public version of ChatGPT. It's pretty bad, for things that I might want to use it for. Mainly knowledge-oriented uses, right? I mean, people do use AI for this to get information, but ChatGPT and the consumer-level AI is actually pretty bad as a source of information and knowledge, especially the deeper you go. But enterprise-level AI that you pay for is much better. So you can see it's been transformed into a club good in that sense, right? Still from the same information, the same freely available information from the internet, essentially, right? But also millions of books that Google already stole decades ago. All right. So why do I call it the epistemic commons instead of the knowledge commons? Because what I'm getting at here, apart from being kind of pretentious philosopher, is that I'm getting at the Peircean epistemology here. And so this point here, that the more open the open knowledge ecosystem is, and the more it's cultivated, the greater the benefit that's accrued and distributed to the public. And this kind of taps into the Peircean model of inquiry. So knowledge is not static, but results from an ongoing communal process of inquiry, adjustment, and revision. In this sense, knowledge requires active cultivation. Right? So it's a bit like the plot of land that I was talking about before is the origin of the commons, right? But you need everyone in there looking after it and actually cultivating it for the good of everyone rather than closing it off and exploiting it for their own gain. Once you start to do that, you can not only corrupt the knowledge on one side, the benefit accrues to private individuals or private companies, but also you stop this participatory aspect of it, right? So if you fence off that piece of land and all the people in the village can no longer go on to the land and enjoy it, they also can't cultivate it. And the open knowledge ecosystem in this sense, if you think about Wikipedia, right, how does Wikipedia work? It works through volunteers going on there, cultivating, the knowledge, if you like, that's available on Wikipedia, correcting errors, adding more information, all through this kind of communal process of people discussing what goes on Wikipedia, making edits to each other's articles and so on. Now, if that's removed, if you can't access that anymore, then that public participatory process breaks down. That's just what I said. All right. So information integrity is another concept. So the same kind of Persian foundation that I'm using to analyze AI and its threat to epistemic value, if you like, underlines my approach to misinformation. I'm not going to talk much about that today, but I can talk about it at the end, if you like. Right, so that same kind of Persian theory of inquiry. Information integrity, though, is a concept. So people were often talking about information disorder. The Council of Europe, Waterloo interaction theory of misinformation. You've got misinformation, which is false and unintentionally spread. You've got disinformation, which is false and intentionally spread. Malinformation, which nobody really understood. But this kind of formed the foundation of regulation in Europe, really, and regulatory approaches everywhere to misinformation and disinformation. In my view, this conceptual scheme is fundamentally flawed, which again I can go into later. But people have moved in any case because there's been some recognition of this, that it's not really all about, the problem is not really all about false information, or even about intention to harm. And the other part of that recognition is that we need to take a kind of broad ecosystem-based approach to the problem. And so now people are moving to talk about information integrity or knowledge integrity, whatever it might be. It's still very poorly defined. And one aspect of what I'm doing with my colleague Heather Ford is working on a definition of information integrity. But, enough to be said that it encompasses problems like misinformation, but is much broader than that. And so you can see then how the problem that I was talking about before, about AI and information integrity or knowledge integrity, the open knowledge ecosystem, fits in with this broader model, right? And so you can encompass these problems. And it also helps to see that the problem with AI is not so much hallucinations and false information, but this more kind of infrastructural problem, and of that open knowledge ecosystem, and the problem of epistemic participation. All right, so information integrity is actually a concept that really comes to us from computer science. They've been talking about it for a long time, but the concept as it's articulated in computer science, which is no doubt very useful for them, is not actually very useful for when we're thinking about the information ecosystem as a whole. So here, looking at two conceptions, there's what we call data. So we call that data integrity, even though most in computer science, they generally call it information integrity. But it's also called data integrity. But here you're talking about the integrity of individual bits of information or files or whatever it might be. And the concept is essentially that whatever the information is, if it goes from its origins to its destination intact, then that's it. That's all you need to do, right? So you get all kinds of user credentialing and that kind of thing, or change tracking, all these things that underpin everything that we do with, digitized information. And blockchain, is part of this as well. And, there's a whole set of, again, infrastructure standards, policies and so on, international agreements, which help this process to occur without problem. But obviously, things like banking and whatnot rely entirely on this being the case. But the way we can model this or conceptualize it is that, so verifiability in this sense, if we can verify the data, right, or the integrity of the data, what we're doing is essentially just ascertaining its authenticity, right? That it's unchanged from its origins, or if it's changed, every change is explicit and tracked, right? So what strikes us about this concept for our purposes is that truth is irrelevant to the integrity of that information, right, or the integrity of the data, right? So whether the data is true or not, that occurs outside the system. Right? All that matters is that the information comes from its origins, gets to a destination intact. Whether it's true or not is another question, right? But if the system fails, if the knowledge is corrupted, then that counts as failure, right, within this system. And I've got a quote here from a website called The Verifiable Web, which is, again, a concept in how you might expand this data integrity model in things like blockchain. But you can see that the title of the website is The Verifiable Web, Fixing the Internet's Truth Problem. And this is actually put forward as a solution to misinformation. Now, from my mind, there's no way it can be a solution to misinformation because there's no truth in the system at all. No guaranteed truth or even any way to work towards the truth within the system, obviously outside the system. There's all sorts of ways that you might do that. Okay, so thinking about integrity, information integrity as knowledge, and in this kind of Peircean sense of inquiry, right? Then the integrity of the information is considered in terms of its function in the information or knowledge ecosystem as a whole, right? Rather than in terms of data or a file or whatever it might be. But in order for this to be the case, you need to be able to assess whether the information is accurate. So truth is kind of built into the system. But in order for that to occur, it has to be part of a kind of communal process of verification or communal process of knowledge building, if you like, right? And so things like Wikipedia work on this basis, right? This will become clearer in a second. Let's skip that. So on Wikipedia, as an example of this kind of knowledge integrity, right? So you can see that from our first model, we have three terms: the editor or the person who made the file, whatever it is, right? And then the person who receives the file, which we could read it. And then there's the data. On Wikipedia, on the other hand, okay, you have the editors, bottom in the middle there, and you have the data or the text, and you have readers. So that part of the model is there. But the editors are drawing on a process of knowledge gathering, if you like. So there's a whole set of policies which underpin how this works on Wikipedia, which I need to go into. But let's say you need to use reliable sources. Reliable sources are those, the academic articles, they might be news articles. Not all news articles or academic articles are reliable, but, you know, as a foundation of it. But then this is built into a whole kind of scientific methodology, if you like, Reed. And that methodology is truth-guided. So people are aiming at producing the truth, whatever it is, in whatever discipline. It might be journalism, it might be physics, who knows, politics even. But people are aiming at discovering the truth, establishing knowledge and making it available. That then through this process comes onto Wikipedia. But when that data is extracted by AI systems, you lose a couple of things, right? So you lose the ability to verify that data as the user when it comes to you, particularly if the source is not displayed. Right? If you don't know it comes from Wikipedia, clearly so. And also this communal process of correction that occurs on Wikipedia. Wikipedia is by no means perfect, right? It contains lots of multitudes of error. But over time, over the long run and on the whole, it tends towards the truth, right? And part of this is the kind of policies that have been established communally. And this kind of gets back into the, my question to Sven the other day, right, is that the kind of principles of inquiry are established bottom up from within the inquiry. And that's exactly what you can see on Wikipedia, where those principles of how do we make Wikipedia the best encyclopedia it can be, well, we establish these principles of what kind of information is acceptable, how people debate that information, and so on. Right, so it moves off. That integrity is broken down. And this is a kind of modelling of that process, right? So the first bit is all the same, but the text or whatever it is extracted as data, combined with unreliable sources. We don't know what they are that go into the AI system. There's also, it's just everything, right? It's just the internet. There's a whole shed load of unreliable sources on there, as well as more reliable sources that get synthesized and represented to the user. But then this ability to participate in the construction of that knowledge is gone, right? So if you think about that, the epistemic commons, right, your ability to get in there and help cultivate public knowledge is removed. Right, that's just what I said before, really. All right. So what might we do about this? That's the next question. So, I mean, there's a number of ways. So one is through copyright, right? So most of the information that is ingested by AI systems is copyright in one way or another. But copyright generally serves commercial interests, not public interests. There is the Creative Commons licensing scheme, which, of course, Wikipedia, all information on Wikipedia is produced under Creative Commons licensing. But the problem there is the one that we've just seen. Creative Commons can be exploited with no consequence. News companies, as I said before, have been making deals with AI companies, but there's a perception that this is not a long-term solution. There's the bargaining code, which is a piece of Australian regulation, which I can talk about if anyone has questions. AI regulation that's been proposed so far and that you can see really in the EU AI Act focuses on high-risk applications of AI, autonomous weapons, that kind of thing, to the extent that there's any recognition of the potential for individual harms. It's focusing on things like sexual deepfakes, which it definitely should focus on, and now a bit more mental health, with the suicides that have occurred through the use of Gen AI. But it's certainly not focused on this kind of general slow degradation of the information environment that kind of we're starting to see now and fearing will only deepen. Tech companies, for their part, as with social media, they say yes, we need to be regulated. But the point is we need to be regulated in the right way. They say. Google invited us to their offices in Sydney a couple of months ago to tell us what was the right way for us to campaign for AI regulation, and it's about not regulating training data. So they don't want any regulation on the training data, for example, high quality data or anything like that. And they certainly don't want to pay for the data. as we saw at the beginning with Meta's head of AI. Taxes and levies being proposed, that they're difficult in an international sense. And when you get the US government, most of these companies are US companies, you get the US government actively campaigning against regulation and using, the threat of tariffs to do so, that undermines that possibility. So what we're kind of starting to, in the next part of this project, what we're looking at is building a kind of framework for AI regulation that is oriented towards this information ecosystem, the open knowledge system, and how we might construct a kind of, at least to begin with, a recognition of its value, right? And a recognition of the way that AI is undermining that value and that public value. So part of this is looking at, there's a few kind of infrastructural elements or technical things that we're hoping there might be agreement on, or development of standards on international standards. Things like making sure that sources are attributed, that you can link through to the source, to develop that verifiability, making sure that the high quality knowledge systems are not kind of sequestered and become private, only accessible if you pay when they're using open knowledge as a source. And what we're looking at is kind of a theory of epistemic rights as underpinning this, where, and this ties into the idea of the commons that I was talking about, where every individual in that community has a right to access the land and to exploit the land, cultivate the land, I should say, for the public good. The same thing here, that if we see that as a kind of, tied in with similar kinds of rights like political participatory rights, but focused on the production of knowledge. An important way to do this really is probably just through funding public AI and trying to get people to use that instead of AI produced, by private companies. And I think part of that will come out of, okay, what is actually going to be, what's going to be better for the user. I think it's part of it, but there's also a sense, people do have a sense of the value in public interest news, for example, public service media. It's seen as more trustworthy and reliable than commercial media, and for good reason. And so I think if public AI is well funded, then it will, as a matter of course, in that sense, people will gravitate towards it for those kinds of uses, knowledge and information type uses. I think commercial AI is great for, some other things, making pictures, narrow uses in particular domains, enterprise uses, and so on. So there I spell out a bit more what epistemic rights are, but I think I've kind of gone into most of that. All right, so that's it as far as the AI stuff goes. If you want to hear more about the Peircean theory of inquiry that I'm talking about and how I relate it to misinformation, and again, as the foundation of this stuff, I'm happy to do that as well. I can carry on for another 15 minutes, or it's up to you. What do you need?
What?
Yep. Okay. Just aware that I spoke for too long last time. So. Yeah. All right. Okay, well, I might go to this. So this is the dominant conceptualization of misinformation that I talked about before, where you have misinformation that's is false, but there's no intent to harm or to deceive. There's disinformation in the middle, which is both false and there's an intent to harm. malinformation, which might be like online abuse or defamation or something. Defamation. Where let's say online abuse, or doxing, for example, right, where the information is not false, but there's an intent to use it to harm. Most regulatory responses have kind of separated that from this conceptual scheme and just focused on misinformation and disinformation. But the important things to note are that obviously truth and falsity are integral to the model, and intent to harm or deceive integral to the model as well. Now, as you all no doubt know, empirical studies of misinformation have shown that, especially the broader ones, right, have shown that that this doesn't really work in practice. Right? So if you focus solely on false information, you leave off a whole kind of range of phenomena which are very intricately connected with misinformation, right? And focusing on false information is not going to give you a picture of what's going on the internet, right? Or how people are being deceived, if they're being deceived by misinformation, which is another question. Right? And what's involved in the propagation of that information as well. Now, if you have this as in kind of experimental studies, it can be useful to have this focus, right? Because it gives you, okay, we're only going to examine a small set of statements, for example, and they're false statements, and we'll see how they spread on social media. Great. Or in psychology, we're going to see, what is the effect of false statements on people's belief acquisition, right? So this is the foundation of quite a lot of experimental studies of misinformation in psychology. But what we're worried about is the actual phenomenon out there, right? We're not really worried about that very tightly controlled thing where, do people acquire false beliefs or not? I mean, as it turns out, you can design an experiment which shows that they do and that they don't. But when on the internet, what people are doing is generally not believing in misinformation and sharing it anyway as a kind of political discourse, right? In-group signalling and all that kind of thing. So truth, the foundation of the problem is not that it's false information. Intent to harm is also very nebulous, but I'm not going to get into that for the moment. I'm mostly interested in the truth side of it. All right, so person inquiry, how does this... this goes back to the problem that I talked about on Monday, which is, who is the arbiter of truth? It can be, you want it to be social media companies. Mark, he doesn't think so. Elon probably would like to be the arbiter of truth and kind of acts like he is, right? At least on X. Donald Trump, we certainly don't want him to be the... So, all right. So for Peirce, knowledge is always communally formed. It's an important thing, one side. And the reason for that is because all of us are fallible. But science itself as a process is inherently fallible. And in fact, for Peirce, science only progresses because of that fallibility, right? And gradually over time, you get closer and closer to the truth. This is what Peirce is famous for, is this, the truth is what will be agreed upon at the end of inquiry. It's his famous formulation. In his early philosophy, he saw that in a kind of instrumental sense, I guess, in which what people actually agree on at the end of inquiry is the truth. But later on in his career, he changed it into a kind of idealistic conception, right? Is that it's an ideal conception of truth, and that what people would agree on, if we were to reach the end of inquiry, that is the truth. So it becomes conditional or an ideal. Not what people will agree on, but what they would agree on if we were ever to get there. And so what that means is that the end of inquiry is not an actual point, but is endlessly deferred. It's like a horizon. Right? All right. So fallibility is built into the concept. And you can see on the quote, the second quote there on the right, individualism and falsity are one and the same. Experience is nothing if it stands alone. If any one person, they're just going to be wrong. Okay? You can't do science on your own. But the communal process of inquiry, this working out, this testing of ideas experimentally in whatever domain, when we think of that, we tend to think of natural science, but for Peirce, there's no distinction. Right? It might be journalism, as I said before. Right? You might have a witness, you bring the witness up, you ring up another witness to corroborate what the first person said. Right? In a court of law, it's the same kind of process. You're drawing on all sorts of kinds of testimony and evidence to get towards the truth. There's no guarantee that you will be there, right? But you're trying to get evidence that's good enough to be able to decide, to make a decision and to act. And that's the point for him. In inquiry, the action that you're looking for is the next part of inquiry. Right? So our next action is to do another experiment, to expand our knowledge more. Right? In a court of law, it's to make a decision. Right? So guilty, not guilty, whatever it is. And so in this concept, you can see that truth is not a criterion for success. Right? And that's how it ties back into this misinformation model that we're looking at before. If we're conceiving of misinformation as false information, then we've got a criterion, and that criterion is the information is true or the information is false. But we all know some things can be clearly true. They might turn out to be false later on. We can be reasonably certain, but never 100% certain, perhaps. And this gets complicated depending on what domain you're looking at. But the point of fallibility is that anything that we believe now might turn out to be wrong. Nonetheless, on the evidence that we have, what criteria are we using for success or to act, to go on? Well, it's not truth, right? It's, okay, our experimental results were what we expected or were not what we expected. That witness was reliable or that witness wasn't reliable, right? And that informs the decision that the judge is making. And so on. So the criteria that people use are more fine-grained, and in different disciplines and different domains of knowledge, these criteria, as I said, emerge from practice. They change over time. They evolve as experimental methods evolve, right? And you can see that on Wikipedia as an example, how those policies have come to be over time, right? Policies like reliable source policy, neutral point of view, verifiability. But the reason that these kind of why these criteria and not other criteria, right? That's one question. Why do we come up with these criteria? Why are these epistemically valuable criteria? Well, for Peirce, it's because this horizon of truth is always there. But for him, it's nothing more than a kind of ethics of inquiry. It's a commitment to the truth. Now, all of us here as researchers are committed in one way or another to that, right? To getting to the bottom of whatever it is that we're investigating. Similar for a court, similar for a journalist, even in political discourse, sometimes in civil political discourse, right? We're trying to solve problems. We're trying to work out what is the case, what needs to be done, what's the best way to go forward. Online, of course, and not only online, but that's the most obvious point when we're talking about online misinformation. That's not what happens. Okay, people are not oriented towards the truth in this way. And, there's all sorts of things. If you have questions, I can go into, but, for Peirce, ethics comes before logic in that sense, right? That we only have logic because we have an idea of what is good argumentation. What guides that? What guides our understanding of good argumentation? It's this orientation towards truth, fundamentally and above all. All right, and one thing that I kind of add to that, which has really come out, you started to see, you saw it a little bit in Perth, but probably more so in Dewey and Mead and others, and then into the more into the social epistemology and so on as it developed through the 20th century, Kuhn and so on as well, that knowledge is institutionally mediated, right? So, if you think of, again, using the example of Wikipedia, it's an institution. It has policies and guidelines and principles. You get inculcated into those when you join as a volunteer. You conform with those principles or, they'll kick you off. And so on. But that doesn't mean that everything's set in stone, right? The institution evolves over time. Principles can change as, according to the circumstances and so on. But that's something that, Peirce didn't talk about that much. Certainly, it's in his theories, but... and so then I look at this idea of degenerate inquiry, which is definitely in Peirce, right? And this is where you don't have that regulative ideal of truth, right? You don't have that guiding horizon that we're aiming towards, right? Even if we're not always sure that we're even going in the right direction. Nonetheless, we have it in mind. And that's what brings people together as inquiries to participate and do things. They don't always agree, but they're guided by that horizon or that regulative ideal, I guess. So for Peirce, an early paper was on the 4 methods of fixing belief. And on the right there, you can see the 4 methods. The method of tenacity, which is just believing what you believe, no matter what. The method of authority, religious teachings, for example, government decree. The a priori method is where you take a set of principles, wherever you get them from, and derive knowledge from that. It's just the Kantian system, something like that. And then the method of science, where you're testing your beliefs experimentally against something that's not part of the system itself. Now, where you don't have this horizon of truth, then inquiry becomes degenerate. It might be guided by other principles. So online, for example, on social media, it might be guided by owning the libs, or just arguing for the trolling, I saw the other day. So your discourse is not guided by this truth as a regulative ideal. At the same time, it's not conducive to producing truth, right? So you end up with all sorts of false beliefs. So Australian Peircean philosopher Kathy Legg put this nicely as, people talk about the post-truth era, but really, are we still in the pre-truth era? And it's just accentuated online in a way that we haven't seen before. We have to talk through that. And so, I have some ideas about how you might, instead of worrying about whether information is true or false, fact-checking and so on, I think it can play a role, but I think we shouldn't focus our regulatory, armory at false information. Instead, we should try to create a space that is more conducive to truth, right? That enables truth to emerge for people who are interested in, discussing things civilly and are interested in what is true and what isn't. And I think, some of the looking at, and this goes into the kind of systems-based regulation that I was talking about on Monday on digital platforms, is another reason why it's important to focus on the systems of the platforms rather than on the content, right? If you focus on the systems, you have algorithms which don't promote engaging content, viral content above all else, right? You have maybe slower algorithms. Some people talk about it. Or there's a bit of work in the kind of slowness of fact checking. There's a kind of slow knowledge in this. And if you slow things down a bit, then there's more space for the truth to kind of emerge over time and people to discuss things with each other more civilly. There's also ideas about kind of adding friction, which again is the same kind of thing, and adding kind of traffic controls, right? Now you can ignore the traffic controls. You can, you can drive at 200 kilometres an hour in a 60 zone if you want to, right? But on the whole, for the most part, people don't, right? People obey the traffic rules. They follow the roads where they lead. And, I think there's a balancing act here in terms of how much you're guiding people. But there's a lot you can do with the affordances of the platform, the algorithms and so on. And I think in like federated social media systems, Mastodon and so on, you can see some of this starting to emerge as well. Cool.
Okay, let me stop this recording.